What are some good ways to bend in order to put something on a low shelf, like that white stool under the table here? This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're looking at low cabinets, low shelves, where there's something in the way. You can't just squat down like I might in order to pick something up that's just on the floor. Well, I can't do that. There's a thing here. And in plenty of other cases, you might need to be able to get underneath something like a higher shelf, or in this case, a table, where you can't even lean over the table itself, right? So if this was a wall or another large set of boxes or something, think like the big shelves at Home Depot or something like that, where you need to sort of like reach way back there. If this area is blocked, how do I interact with something underneath it that's pretty far down there without straining myself, without hurting myself, and for those of us who are interested in Alexander Technique, with a good use of the self, right? How do we organize ourselves for this? That's what we're exploring today. So, this fun little toy is just our object to be placed on various surfaces. So we're going to start with the most basic version of this, interacting with down at all. When I go to put something down, I can just use my arm. If something is particularly heavy and I need to carry it on my forearms, maybe I'll set it down by using my legs. And depending on the setup that I'm in, I might not be completely square and perpendicular to the surface I'm interacting with. This is where we need to talk about spirals. I'm defining a spiral as rotating around the axis of the spine. And in this case, because we're standing at the moment, that spiral might also go all the way down to the feet. So when I just turn my head on its own, it's actually not just the head, really, that's turning, because the skull isn't like picking itself up off of the neck and swiveling around. I'm spiraling in my neck. That's just the upper part of my spine. Now, because the neck doesn't have any ribs attached to it, or pelvis attached to it, we have a lot of mobility here. Same with right at the waist area. Depending on the person, there will be more or less mobility at the waist, depending on your proportions and everything surrounding the skeletal system. There's so many variables to that, but most people have a lot of turning ability at the neck, unless something has come up, some sort of injury or structural condition that would limit being able to rotate the vertebrae in the neck. It's your cervical vertebrae. So anytime you see medical folks referring to parts of the spine with a letter and then a number, that letter refers to the part of the spine, and then the number is numbered vertebrae, which ones you're looking at. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae, so this would be considered C, 1 through 7. So I'm rotating my stack of blocks on top of each other. If I distribute that spiral and that rotation over more of the spine and a greater number of vertebrae, stacked blocks, each one will have to rotate less. It's a little bit more efficient, and it tends to avoid situations like repetitive strain from having a really sharp twist at any one particular spot. So I can turn, in my case, pretty much all the way to 90 degrees with just my neck, where I've got my chin pretty much straight over my shoulder. That's a lot of work to stay there. At the end there, I kind of use my hand to even push it there. I don't recommend staying there for very long. It's not good for you. Another option for how to turn to the side is a longer spiral. Your whole self is available to help with this motion. That's how I encourage you to think about it. All of you is available. And that doesn't mean that you have to move at any one particular spot. It means that you can make some well-informed decisions on how are you moving and where are you deciding to spiral from, going from side to side. So for example, if I am talking to a camera or a student, right? I'm a teacher, this is a university. When I have students in here, like I just had one in here about 20 minutes ago, if my student is over there and I need to put something down, but I want to still have a conversation, I'm likely going to keep most of my body oriented towards my student. I would imagine that this might have some different kind of social expectations in different cultures. I don't really know. It's something that I'm very interested in, seeing how different cultures around the world handle body language and nonverbal cueing. But I think for a lot of people, say if you're the student over there and your teacher goes over this way for a minute, you might think my teacher has stopped engaging or like stopped paying attention to me, like she's not really looking. So if I need to put this over here, I might spiral for just a second and then come back, and I can even have a double spiral where I've spiraled to my right towards the table here and then back towards my left and towards my student in my upper spine, in my neck, my cervical spine. So that is a double spiral at different points in the spine. And we can use this to really great effect, and it's going to look very fluid. That was it. Did you catch it? So I kept most of my body here towards the camera, my imaginary student. I can spiral one way and back, or if I want to take my face this way, I could keep from neck down towards my student and just spiral in my neck and my arm in order to put my object down. It's really interesting to look at how do we perceive these things socially. It's something that I got interested in because my only sibling is on the autism spectrum, and so he does not read things like that intuitively. And I have had such fascinating conversations with my brother looking at what are the actual, like, factual observation mechanics that you're observing, and how are you really deliberately and consciously translating that into social cueing and nonverbal communication. I think it's just a really cool intersection of his daily life and my daily life. So now we're going to get into what happens when I need to put this thing on the stool underneath this table. Join me on the floor. All right, it's a bit of a better view from here. I've lowered the camera a bit. So when I go to interact with something that is quite low and forward, there are a few different options. I could face directly at the surface, the shelf that I'm aiming for here. But the problem with that is my line of sight frequently, and in this case, is blocked. So the blanket that we've got on the table here is in the way of me being able to see where I'd want to put this on the white stool under there. So I frequently will give this to my students, generally after they've already had one round of 10 lessons. This tends to be a more complicated process. I give them this as a problem-solving challenge, and I give them no instructions, no hints. I just hand them this and say, I would like you to put this on the stool under the table. Go. See what happens. Go through the problem-solving process. It's really interesting to watch people work through this in their bodies and in their brains and analysis of how are they moving. One thing that I had one student recently do was he just lifted this and said, well, the thing is in my way, so I'm just going to lift it. And then he kind of went around the strut of the table here and placed the tensegrity toy right on the stool that way. Another one did a sort of side bend, and he did it in a way that was pretty well organized. Again, when we come back to this idea of we want to distribute any really big spine movement over a bunch of vertebrae, when that includes sideways. It's not just for spiraling, it's also including for a bend. So I call it being a well-distributed banana. This was something that I had already worked on with this particular student before. So he went into this fully aware of like, okay, well-distributed banana, and this student is like 6'4". There's a lot of him to have to bend. So when we go into this side bend, thinking of that as lengthening along that bend, and you can do that even in a squat. So he went for a kind of a this kind of bend, and I think he braced with one hand and then went that way. Very few people approach this in the way that I would recommend approaching it, which is why I cover it with a lot of my students, especially the ones who continue for more than one round of 10 lessons. We can approach this diagonally and use a spiral. So one option is to go fully onto the knees and then approach this at a diagonal. So I'm not just at this angle because my camera's over there. I'm at this angle because this is how I'm going to approach the shelf on my right. If I go down from here by pivoting at the hip joints and then spiral in my spine, this is quite comfortable. It's pretty easy, and I can see all the way back to the wall because I have lowered my eye line to be below the edge of the blanket here and then just spiraled. So again, that's the same spiral as this. I'm not exclusively turning in my neck. I could, but it's kind of a lot of extra work to stabilize this and then like crank the neck way over. It's just allowing a spiral up and over along the whole spine. And that works no matter the angle of the hip joints, because your hip joints are not your spine. So if I put myself at an angle here, you might be able to see this better. No matter what angle my hip joints here are at, I can still spiral. This is the same spiral the whole time, as far as what my spine is doing. The difference is the angle of my legs, which start at the hip joints. The final way I want to talk about working with this is the difference between a low squat versus being on your knees. Now, in my case, I cannot keep my heels on the floor when I go into a low squat. The only times that I would is if I'm like holding something really heavy out in front of me and I'm like leaning way back out behind myself here and kind of counterbalancing that way. This is hard, it doesn't work. So when I'm in my standard low squat that I use all the time, my heels are not touching, and that's okay. I always consider it kind of, it just looks like cheating when people are able to do that because they have so much more stability in a low squat than I do, and like, it just doesn't happen. My legs don't move that way. So I can use this diagonal approach and spiral in the spine in this low squat as well. The difference here is, first of all, do I want to put my knees on the ground in whatever situation I'm in? If I'm like outdoors or on really hard concrete, maybe I don't want to put my knees on the ground. So maybe I would just drop down into a low squat, probably stabilize with one hand, and look, in a spiral off to my right. Again, I can see the back wall underneath this quite easily. The difference there is stability and how much time I'm going to be there. So you might have noticed, or if you want to go and pause the video and go back a little bit and notice, when I turned to talk to the camera for a while, I went down onto my knees rather than staying in the low squat earlier. Because it's just a lot more tiring to be in this really low squat for a long time. It's also a really sharp angle on my knees. And so it's just a little bit harder for me to stay there for long periods of time. If I'm going to be lifting something heavy along the ground and not going up into standing, I'll probably also want to do that on my knees because it gives me lots of stability to do this low spiral. So what I encourage you to play around with is when you are reaching for things on low shelves, think like if you have pots and pans on a low cabinet in your kitchen. How do you approach that? Can you give yourself kind of a menu of different options to work with, like we did today? Running through that problem-solving process is part of the skills of Alexander Technique. So I encourage you to give it a try and find out, what is it that you do? And do you want to change anything? Give it a try, see what happens.